Hello, gamers. After getting my fleet wiped out by the hivers and all the nonsense they can throw at you, I figure now's as good a time as any to do a fighter tier list for the vanilla fighters. They're also easier to rank than missiles, so the missile tier list will have to come later. Still working on that one. Now, before I get into exactly which fighters are good or bad and why, there's a few things you need to know about fighters that aren't well explained in the game. A lot of people struggle to make fighters good, and that's probably because of these two mechanics that aren't very well understood. The first is fighter engagement, related to officer personality. So if you have bombers on your carrier, it's going to send them offensively pretty much all the time. Not constantly, as mind you. What I mean is, it's not going to use them defensively. Because if you have fighters or interceptors, what a lot of officers will try to do is it'll try to send them as an escort for one of your friendly ships. So let's say you have a cautious or a steady officer. They'll like to send your broadswords, your talons, they'll send them to escort a friendly ship. And this is terrible. This is awful. If I wanted fighters escorting my ships, I would use converted hangar and defensive targeting array. If my carrier, which is explicitly here to bring fighters, is sending all of them to escort one ship, that's a problem. And that's assuming it's escorting a good target. A lot of the time it's not. It'll escort some random destroyer, and even when the destroyer is completely disengaged and away from the enemy, the fighters will keep sitting around it, doing nothing. It's really a huge waste of the DPS that those things could be doing. So your carrier more or less ends up wasting its time. This is why, if you've got a carrier that's got fighters or interceptors, you really need to give it an aggressive officer. Reckless would be a bad idea because it's a carrier, you don't want it to be reckless. But as long as you give it an aggressive officer, and it doesn't have too many weapons, it'll stay at range, intelligently, the way that it should. But if you do give it weapons, an aggressive officer will get closer, so you have to be careful with that. Don't put any close range weapons or moderate range weapons. You want an aggressive officer with either just point defense and missiles, or long range weapons if you're going to go that route. But you absolutely need that aggressive officer to make a fighter or interceptor carrier work. It is crucial that they're actually sending them at the enemy and not trying to escort your allies. It's a huge waste. So that's the first thing you need to know. If you find that your fighters are often underperforming, that can be one of the reasons. The other reason is replacement time. Because on paper, you might think that one ship having double the replacement time compared to another fighter would make it take twice as long. But it's actually worse than that. The reason is because whenever a fighter dies, the drain on replacement rate is proportional to how long it takes to replace the fighter. So a 5-second fighter versus a 10-second fighter, it's not just that the 5-second fighter comes back in half the time, it also drains half the replacement rate. That's a big deal. So if you have a wing that drains, let's say, 20 seconds of your total, like the whole wing gets wiped out and it drains 20 seconds to bring them all back, you're not going to lose too much replacement rate. Versus a wing that takes 48 seconds to come back, it's going to drain far more replacement rate. So it's a lot worse than actually just being double. And here's the thing that gets even crazier. I said that it's proportional to replacement time. And that includes the extra time from having low replacement rate. So the lower your replacement rate, the longer it takes. And the longer it takes, the more it drains your replacement rate. So you might lose, say, a broadsword, and it takes 10 seconds to replace and drains X amount of replacement rate. That's only at 100%. If it's at 50%, that broadsword not only takes twice as long, it's draining twice as much of your replacement rate. This is why a lot of the time carriers don't actually sit around like 40, 50, 60% replacement rate. They spend very little time in that range because there's usually one of two things that happens. Either the replacement rate is fast enough that they can mostly recover in between attack runs. And so they hover around 80 to 90%, maybe dipping down to 70%, but usually up 70, 80, 90%. Or if they drop below 70%, then they're almost guaranteed they will spiral down to the minimum at 30%, where it can't go any lower. Those are the two outcomes. They never really hang around 40, 50, or 60 for long periods of time because of that death spiraling effect. So, replacement rate and replacement speed are very important to manage. You can have fighters that die and death spiral your carrier, and they can work in shorter battles, like in the early game. But when you get to the later game, and battles are going to take longer, and the enemy's got more point defense coverage, keeping that replacement rate low is extremely important. Otherwise, they're just going to drop to 30% and be useless for most of the battle. So between those two things, the officer aggression and the replacement rate death spiral, being aware of these two things is essential if you actually want to make fighters work. So with that in mind, let's get started with our first, the miningpod auxiliary, a zero-cost support fighter. It's literally free. It's terrible. Here's the thing. You might think that it's free, but it's really not. Consider converted hanger. If you want to put this as a support ship on one of your non-carriers, that converted hanger costs you 10 ordnance points, and you're putting one of these in it? No, it's not good enough. It's not worth 10 ordnance points. But what about a regular carrier? Well, first of all, most of them aren't battle carriers, so completely useless. But even if it is a battle carrier, why are you mounting one of these? Because our next fighter, the Talon, costs 2 ordnance points, and it's actually surprisingly good. The Talon being in the game and existing is the reason you are never going to use mining pods. Because on carriers, the ones that, actual carriers and not the ones that have converted hanger, they have lower ordnance points than other ships of a similar deployment and a similar class. And the reason for that is because you essentially pay 10 ordnance points for each fighter bay. That's more or less how it works. So if you look at the ordnance points of a carrier, it's a lot lower than a similar ship. But if you imagine instead that you added 10 ordnance points per fighter bay, so if it's got 3, add 30, then that's what it should have if it was not a carrier. You're essentially you're forced to pay for them, really. You're forced to pay for the fighter bays on a carrier. So if you're filling it with something that costs 0, it's not really free. You are just forced to pay for the hangars. And you'd better be getting your value out of it, which the mining pods just don't. I do not care that they're free. I don't care that they're cheap. Anywhere you could buy a mining pod, you could buy a Talon, and anything you would want to do with a mining pod is superseded by the Talon. Now that might be a bit different because you think, well, it's a support fighter versus an offensive fighter. Just find defensive targeting ray. Just get that hull mod and stick it in with the Talons. It's going to do better than anything the mining pods are ever going to do for very little extra cost. 2 ordnance points, guys. These things are solid. A big part of the reason why is the low replacement rate. 5 per fighter. Another thing that's important with the replacement rate is the larger the wing is kind of a downside there. Because a lot of the time, fighter wings are, if they get wiped out, it's not just going to be 1 or 2 fighters. A lot of the time what happens is the whole wing gets wiped out. So you can think of it like more fighters per wing increases the damage potential, but it also increases the risk. Because the penalty when they get wiped out is going to be higher, and it's going to drain more of your replacement rate in the process of bringing them back. Talons being at 4 is a little above average for most fighter wings, but being at such a low replacement rate, 5 is extremely low, so they rarely ever drain much of your replacement rate, despite being extremely fragile. And for only 2 ordnance points, they're fast, and they can actually do some decent damage. 4 Vulcans that can, and they have the flux to actually fire them constantly. I'll mention this later as it becomes relevant, but fighters do have independent flux stats. Just because a fighter has a ton of weapons doesn't mean it can shoot all of them constantly. The Talon is one of the few fighters that can actually do that. It has enough flux to just fire its Vulcan constantly, and it has reloading swarmer missiles. Now, it's fragmentation damage, but when you've got 4 Vulcans, which just have inherently high DPS, not only are they good against hull, they're actually pretty decent against shields. And then the swarmers help strip off armor so that they can get to hull. Their main weakness is that they're going to die a lot, and then you're going to have to replace a lot of crew, so there's a cost to that logistically. But their performance it really doesn't leave much to be desired for something that only costs 2 ordnance points. It's in a good spot. I would really recommend using them. Wasps. I'm going to put these in C. Now, these also have a replacement rate of 5, a time of 5. They've got a larger wing, so if they get wiped out, they're going to take a bigger chunk of your replacement rate. The problem with wasps is, compared to talons, their offensive potential against enemy ships is pretty minimal. Like, talons aren't going to kill larger ships, but they can certainly be a major threat to frigates, especially in numbers. Wasps just don't really do that. Now, they're not useless, because I think wasps are the clear best at intercepting enemy fighters. For the most part, interceptors don't actually intercept enemy fighters. They're mostly just for chasing down frigates. But in the case of the wasps, this is actually the anti-fighter fighter. On top of that, they don't have any crew, so while they do die a lot, just like talons, they're not costing you any crew. So that's nice. The main thing that makes them really good at this is that even if the enemy fighters bring flares, like let's say they've got broadswords, which carry flares, the problem with, let's say, sparks, with their burst lasers, is that they get distracted by flares, because they're point defense weapons. In fact, most fighters carry point defense weapons, and they get distracted by flares. So, sparks with their burst lasers end up emptying all of their charges into the flares that the enemy fighters deployed, and then they're stuck at just waiting for their charges to come back, which is a problem when they've got half the recharge rate of a normal burst laser. Now, wasps with their PD lasers have the same problem a little bit, but they've got a second weapon, the Stinger-class proximity mine. Whenever they encounter missiles or fighters, they just dump a bunch of these mines onto the field, and these mines don't care about flares. Not only that, they do a pretty hefty chunk of damage. Like, these flares, or these mines, can wipe out enemy fighters even against flares. Like, if you take wasps and you put them in a converted hangar on, let's say, a hammerhead or a sunder, and you give them defensive targeting ray, so that you really do want defensive targeting ray pretty much all the time with these things, because if you're sending them to attack the enemy with PD lasers, they're not going to accomplish much. So you want defensive targeting ray so that they stay around the carrier, and it's boosting their damage against fighters by 50%. So now you've got these PD lasers that can shoot down missiles, not very reliably, but they do shoot down some of them. And then if you get swarmed by fighters, in fact I tested this, 2 broadswords, 2 wings of broadswords on a condor, against 1 wing of wasps in a converted hangar with defensive targeting array, and guess what? The wasps win. Even though even though they're outnumbered, 2 wings against 1 wing, and the broadswords are more expensive, the wasps in the converted hangar stayed up around 70% replacement rate, whereas the condor with its 2 broadswords plummeted down to 30%. It took a little while, but the wasps really do their job against fighters. They don't do much else, but in that specific niche, they are really good. On top of that, converted hangar increases the deployment points of your ship based off of the ordnance point cost of the fighters. And that the threshold is 5. Every 5 points increases it by 1, so being and it rounds up. So being at exactly 5 means that they're just below the threshold of going from 1 deployment point to 2. They're just below that threshold. They're in that sweet spot, making them... So on top of the fact that they're great against enemy fighters with defensive targeting ray, they're also just at the perfect spot where they only give you that 1. Which, by the way, mining pods also increase it by 1. Even though they're 0, the minimum increase is always 1. So for converted hangar, wasps are the way to go most of the time with that defensive targeting ray. And for something offensive, talons are pretty good. These are your cheap options. Then we get up to the gladius. I'm also going to put that in C. It's a little more expensive than talons, but what's really nice about the gladius is you really don't use these by themselves. The main job that they have is escorting talons. because the main problem that we've talked about with talons is their durability. They're very fragile. Now, gladius takes up twice the replacement rate, but there's also only 2 of them, which means that if the wing gets wiped out, they're draining about the same amount as the talons are. And the reason that they're really good escorts for the talons is partly because their top speed is similar. Actually, that might even be a third thing that I didn't mention that can limit the effectiveness of your fighters. Most of the time you want their speeds to be about the same, because if you send them on an attack run, they slow down to match the speed of the slowest one. So if you've got talons with broadswords, talons are pretty good, broadswords are pretty good, but the broadswords are a lot slower than the talons. So that mismatch in speed can limit the effectiveness of like one of the main advantages of the talons, which is how fast they are. But in this case, the gladius is really good as an escort for talons because it's about the same speed. It's only 25 points slower, 300 versus 325 is really not a big difference. And they bring flares. So they can keep up with the talons, and they can mitigate how fragile they are by distracting enemy point defense with flares. And then on top of that, they bring machine guns, where the talons have swarmers for anti-light armor, and then they have Vulcans for anti-hull. They're only okay against shields. They're going to struggle a bit more against high-tech shields. The machine guns that the gladius bring do a lot to solve that problem. So if you've got a carrier with one gladius wing and 1 talon wing, or 2 talon wings, depending on how many you've got, it's a very solid combination and very cheap. They're going to be effective against light craft. They're going to be kind of wasted against heavier craft, though. I wouldn't send them against a cruiser, although the AI might. So one of the things that you can do that makes carriers more effective is giving them specific strike orders instead of letting the AI pick at random. So you can open up tab, look at the enemy fleet, and if, let's say that you've set things up so that all of your carriers have interceptors that are meant to target enemy frigates. What you do is you just look at the map, you look at all the enemy frigates, you click on them, you hit S, and you do that for all of them, so that as soon as your carriers finish off one of the fighters, they're automatically going to be targeted to another one of the... Finish off one of the frigates, they're automatically then going to find another one because you've already set up all the orders. They're just going to go from frigate to frigate to frigate. That's probably the ideal way to use this sort of strategy. If you're struggling against frigates and they're distracting your bigger ships, they're wasting their time, they're getting in, they're being annoying, this is a pretty good counter strategy. They're also good against phase ships, especially phase frigates. That's twice as good. Yeah, I guess I can't say they're good against phase ships. They're not good against the Doom, that's for sure. But against a Harbinger or any of the frigates, yeah, they're pretty good. Broadsword. Is that really a surprise? It's S tier. It is the railgun of the fighter bay. That's what it is. It's not always the best option, but it's always a decent option. It's relatively cheap at 8 ordnance points. 30 replacement time for the wing is close to interceptor level, so it's not too bad. Their speed at 200 is pretty middle of the road, so it's not too slow. Their durability is the second highest, next to the Warthog. And they've got 750 armor and 100 armor. Really durable for fighters, on top of having flares. And then the light machine guns make them pretty good against shields. And against lightly armored frigates, eventually those machine guns are going to do really good damage. They've just got great stat line across the board for their cost, and then on top of that, they're very versatile. You can load up a carrier with broadswords, and it's going to do okay. It's going to support you against larger ships just by driving up their flux, and they can often kill frigates on their own, given enough time. On top of that, they really synergize with bomber wings. Being at 200 speed means that they have the same top speed as the fastest bombers. So they're never going to... You can mix them in with a bomber wing, and they're never going to slow them down. And then the flares that they bring are great for distracting enemy point defense to help the bomber's payload get in. And as if that always wasn't enough, the way that their machine guns are set up is for heavy burst damage. This is where fighter flux becomes really important. They have pretty terrible dissipation, so they can't keep up with the flux generated by their two machine guns. But they do have okay flux capacity. What this means is that broadswords do a lot of kinetic damage in a short burst up front, and then they hit the limit of their flux capacity, and now they're gate-capped by their dissipation. So their DPS falls off once they hit their capacity, but when they first make contact with the target, they get a large burst of kinetic damage. This, along with the flares, and along with their top speed being just right, helps them synergize with bombers really well, because you can pair them with high explosive bombers, and the broadswords not only help their payload get in with the flares, they also help punch through enemy shields with their burst of kinetic damage. They are very well designed as an escort for bombers, in the same way that the gladius is an escort for interceptors. But on top of that, they're just very generically good. If you don't know what to put in a carrier, load it up with broadswords. I would never say that all broadswords is the best option that's available to you, but it's a good baseline to compare against. Just start with a bunch of broadswords, see how it does, and then you can start fiddling around with different combinations of fighters, and ask yourself, is this doing better than the broadswords? Especially if you're paying more ordnance points than the broadswords. They should be doing better than the broadswords. You should find a combination or a niche for them that's doing better than what the broadswords were doing. And if not, you've got to experiment a little more. All broadswords is not the best choice, but it's going to do decent, and it's a good baseline to compare against. Very versatile, very good. That's the S tier fighter. It's the railgun of the fighter bay. The Claw, C. The Claw doesn't really do a whole lot on its own. It looks really good in the simulator, because this thing is, even with high delay ion cannons, 5 of them can shut off a ship and make it completely helpless, which in a 1v1 in the simulator looks really good. The problem is that in a real fight where the enemy has multiple ships, especially as we get later into the game, you might disable one ship, and normally that would mean its point defense can't shoot back, but when it has allies around it that also have point defense, they can shoot down the Claw, and suddenly it looks a lot less powerful. There's a couple of places that I would put this. The main combinations I would do is, if I've got like 3 or 4 fighter bays and I'm loading them up with broadswords, I would swap one of the broadswords out for a Claw wing, because the combination of kinetic and EMP damage means they can kill frigates, and against heavier targets that they can't kill, they can at least drive up their hard flux with the kinetics, and then force them to drop their shields, which opens them up to some EMP damage. Another problem with the Claw is the replacement time. 8 per fighter doesn't sound that bad, but they're relatively fragile, and there's 5 of them. So if they get wiped out, that's actually a 40-second replacement time, even harder than the broadswords. And when you get up to 40 seconds, you're going to start to feel that on your replacement rate. In fact, you might even feel 30 seconds on your replacement rate, but the broadswords kind of get away with it because they're so durable. If you had a less durable fighter, at 30 seconds, it's also going to be taking a heavier toll. So that's the first thing I would do with the Claws, combine them with like 2 or 3 broadsword wings. The other thing I would do is mix it in with talons and gladius. Now, when it's mixed in with the broadswords, they do have to slow down by 75, but broadswords are so good, and the synergy there is so good that it's not that much of an issue. On the flip side, if you mix them in with talons, with a talon and gladius wing, it's about the same speed again. It's 25 slower than the gladius, so it's not really slowing them down too much. And now you've got a combination of these fast fighters that bring kinetic damage, they bring EMP damage, they bring fragmentation, they bring high explosive, and in fact, the gladius even has an IR pulse laser, so they're bringing energy. I don't really mention the gladius, the IR pulse laser on the gladius, because it's not that good. Like, not just that the IR pulse itself isn't great, but the version that fighters have actually costs extra flux. It's honestly there, like, yeah, it gives it a little bit of an extra armor punch and a little bit of extra hull damage, but for the most part, you're going to rely on the talons for that anyways. The main thing that the IR pulse laser does is it uses up all of its flux, which I should have mentioned. It does have better flux stats, much better flux stats than the broadswords. So another advantage that the gladius has is it's got better sustained damage than broadswords do. But yeah, those are the 2 kinds of places I would use the Claw. Either mix it in with the talon gladius combo, which is Honestly, kind of like a budget Thunder. They're slower than Thunders, but they bring the same idea of kinetic and swarmers and EMP for a significantly cheaper price, while having similar performance. So it's a pretty, like, those are the two combinations where I'd use claws. Other than that, I don't see much of a use for them. They're pretty niche. Sparks. Now this is where we might get a little controversial. I'm going to put them in D. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. Because I tested these a fair bit, and compared to wasps, they're worse at intercepting enemy fighters, and compared to talons, they're worse at destroying enemy frigates. Now, that might be hard to notice because the upfront damage that they do is really good. When they've got their charges stored up in those burst lasers, they can do a lot of good damage. But having a 10-second replacement time for an interceptor, I don't care that they've got shields, they're still very fragile. And there's 5 of them. So what ends up happening is you might have a wing of talons versus a wing of sparks, and the sparks are going to do more upfront damage, and the talons are going to die, and it looks like, oh, well, clearly the sparks are doing better. But then what happens is the talons take so much less time to replace, and the sparks drain much more of your replacement rate, that in the end, the talons end up killing the target faster and only drain you down to like 90% replacement rate, where the sparks drain you down to like 60%, and they take longer despite being more expensive. And as I mentioned earlier, they end up dumping all of their burst laser charges into flares if the enemy is sending... Now, this is less of an issue if the enemy fighters don't have flares, but if you're against remnants, the Lux fighter has flares, so that's an issue. And if you're against humans, some of the most dangerous fighters are going to be broadswords, which have flares, or warthogs, which also have flares. So that flare issue really kills their defensive potential, on top of the fact that being at 8 ordnance points means that they increase your deployment points by 2. Couple all of that with the heavier toll on your replacement time, 50 seconds per wing, I don't think that they're very good. Now, maybe if you're trying to do a strategy where you're massing up fighters and you're going all in on fighter spam, they might be okay, but that's also specifically the strategy that got them nerfed in the first place. And to be honest, fighter spam is it's got a few problems. It's pretty mediocre overall. And then on top of that, it's kind of boring. You just sit back and watch them do all the work. Now, don't get me wrong, it's got the novelty factor. It's kind of cool to see it happen a few times. But it gets old. It gets old fast compared to other strategies. So, yeah, I think overall they're in D. It sucks, but I can't see a reason to use these offensively over Talon Gladius combo, and I can't see a reason to use them defensively over Wasps. So, strictly speaking, they're not terrible, but they definitely have all of their strength up front, and then if they get wiped out, they're going to be a lot harder on you. For a more expensive ordnance point cost, it's hard to put them higher than D. Now, the Thunder. I'm going to put that up in B. As you can see, 2 per wing, 15 replacement time. This means that the wing has the same overall replacement rate drain as the broadsword, but compared to the broadsword, they're significantly more fragile and they don't have flares. So they are a lot harder on your replacement rate. But what the Thunders have going for them is that 6,000 engagement range and the highest top speed out of any fighter. These things get around. On top of that, their weapon package is really solid. They've got a light dual machine gun for dealing with shields. They've got swarmers for dealing with light armor. And then they've got ion cannons to disable ships. That's kind of the ideal weapons package. And that's also why I called the earlier combo of Claw, Gladius, and Talon the budget version of Thunders. Because these things at 10 ordnance points versus like 2, 6, and 8. Overall, I think they're actually less effective than the Talon Gladius Claw combo. They're worse at killing ships, on top of being more expensive. But what they've got going for them is that top speed and that engagement range. If you want to stack up a bunch of fighters you want to have a bunch of carriers around the map and stack up a bunch of fighters on a single target and just completely overwhelm it, Thunders are the way to go. What was I going to say? There was something else I wanted to say about this. Hold on. Oh, right. Speed. Top speed. Now, some people will tell you that thunders are terrible because all they do is spin around the target without shooting at it. There's a specific issue with thunders that you need to be aware of. At a top speed of 450, they work fine. They do attack runs just the way that you would expect. But if you get fighter uplink, and you put an officer in the ship, that boosts their top speed by 30%. And the problem you run into is that their maneuverability does not keep up with their top speed. So with that 30% boost, they end up trying to turn towards the target, but they're flying forward so fast that they just orbit the target and shoot at nothing. If you're running thunders in the current patch, you really do not want fighter uplink. It actually makes them worse. Now, the good news is that Alex, the developer, seems to be aware of this, and in the next patch, he's buffing their maneuverability by a lot. So, when the next patch comes out, this will not be an issue. But for now, fighter uplink is a no-go if you're running thunders. On top of that, thunders don't mix well with other types of fighters. Because of their top speed is so much higher than everything else, and because they're the only fighter with a 6,000 engagement range, if you're running thunders, you're only running thunders. If you've got a heron with a thunder in it, you don't want to mix it with other things. It's just thunders. So let's say that you want to run thunders in your fleet. Well, what you might find yourself doing is running like 3 herons or 3 moras, loading up with only thunders, and then what you can do is, because your fleet only runs thunders, you can skip out on fighter uplink and not feel too bad about it. Because if you have like one with thunders and one with some other type, that other type would really benefit from fighter uplink and the top speed boost. But if you're only running thunders, then you can skip it and not feel too bad about it. Piranha D. This is just a worse version of the flash bomber. Whatever you want this thing to do, the flash bomber is going to do better. What keeps this out of F tier is the fact that the flash bomber you only get after you start fighting remnants. This thing you can get early and cheaply. So if you're finding yourself fighting against dominators or capital ships or pirate bases, against those slow-moving targets with a lot of point defense, they're going to do all right. They spam standard bombs all over the field, and they just slowly drift towards the target, and they can overwhelm point defense. Obviously, they're pretty terrible against anything that can move because their projectiles are so slow. But that's about it. You're going to mostly use these, if you use them at all, to take on early pirate bounties against those tier 1 battle stations that they have. Once you get to later on in the game, there's really no reason to use these over the flash bomber. The Lux Heavy Fighter D. I considered putting it in F, but I figured it's not that bad. But it's not good either. Now, one of the advantages that shielded fighters have is that they don't generate any flux with their weapons. So where the IR pulse laser, the one that both has a slower rate of fire and more flux per shot that the gladius has, these have the same thing, but because they have shields, their weapons don't actually generate any flux. But because they have shields, if they block something in overload, they're going to stop shooting for a little bit. Whereas if it relies on armor for its defenses, that's going to be less of an issue. Now, they are a little bit faster than broadswords. There's an extra one in the wing. Their damage output is pretty solid. They've got decoy flares. But a big issue is that replacement time. 12 per fighter, and there's 4 of them. So we go from the broadswords being at 30 seconds to these guys being at 48. And remember what I said about replacement rate getting like twice the replacement rate is more than twice as bad. So these things are a little over 50% more replacement time. I'd say that's an issue. Overall, they're a little more fragile, even with the shields in consideration. So the big problem is, why am I spending more ordnance points for these things? They don't have pilots, I guess, so they're not going to cost me as many credits to replace those meat bags that were inside of the broadswords. But overall, there's just less reason to use these. I mean, in theory, you could mix them in with a couple broadsword wings, and they provide a bit more punch against lighter targets. But generally, I would rather have claws, because against lighter targets, the broadswords are going to kill them eventually, and against heavier targets, the Zyra pulse lasers are still not going to do much. So I'd rather have the EMP. Yeah, there's not much of a reason to use these. Longbow, that's an A tier. The cheapest, well, not the cheapest bomber, but the second cheapest bomber, right after the piranha. It's also the fastest bomber. It's also the only bomber that has a point defense weapon. It's also the only kinetic bomber. They're pretty good. You pair these up with broadswords, they're going to do a nice punch of kinetic damage against a target. The burst lasers help them push their way through missiles and enemy fighters. They're cheap. Their replacement time is 18 seconds, which is... if you had more of them in the wing, that would be painful, but with only 2, that keeps it down to 36. Now, they are fragile, so if you're just running longbows and they're getting shot down, it's going to hurt. But if you pair them with broadswords, again, that's going to help their survivability a lot, especially since bombers just have to drop off their payload and then they can leave. They're giving the enemy less time to shoot back. So they don't drain your replacement rate too much. They're relatively cheap. The sabos are... well, they're essentially long-range sabos, which... the range of a sabo is its only weakness. It's a huge burst of kinetic damage. It's got EMP. The only problem with them is that they're short range. The longbow is just that. It's a sabo on a stick, really. There's not much bad that you can say about them. Longbows are pretty good. Khopesh. Not quite as good as the longbow, but they're also cheap. They're also one of the faster bombers at 180. They have an even better replacement time. And one of the problems that shielded bombers have is if they overload on the way to the target, they can't release their payload. So then they end up doing an attack run over it, and then they continue trying to do attack runs until the overload ends, which it usually won't. Usually what's going to happen is if they overload, they're just going to fly around meaninglessly until they die. The khopesh, being more reliant on hull and armor, doesn't have this issue as much. On top of that, those annihilator pods spreading out at close, when you get close to the target, against larger targets, the fact that the shots spread out is not really an issue because they're all going to hit the target. But against faster targets, the spread means that some of those are going to hit even if the enemy tries to dodge. See, unguided rockets, not so effective against frigates most of the time, but because of the spread, a few of these might actually hit. They're fast, replacement rate is good, cost is low. Not quite as good as the longbow, but overall a pretty solid choice. You can, for example, put 4 of these on the Legion, and then put Gauss cannons on the Legion, and watch it sit back and shoot the enemy from long range. Now, yeah, that's pretty good. They're nothing crazy, but they get the job done. Warthog. This is the most expensive fighter, and for good reason. Because the AI, when evaluating fighter threat levels, doesn't tell the difference between fighters. So an AI is going to treat a swarm of talons coming in the same as a warthog. This is part of the reason why there's a couple of reasons why fighters don't get any stronger than this. One of them is because the devs don't want fighters to be the dominant strategy, where you just spam them and then you never have to actually fight the enemy. You just sit back at long range and let your fighters take care of it. They want fighters to be more of a support weapon. That's one of the reasons that only bombers get more expensive from here. Well, bombers and support fighters, but we'll get to that. The other reason is the threat evaluation. Because after doing some testing with mods where they have more expensive fighters, one of the problems you run into is that even if it's being swarmed by fighters that are worth like 30 ordnance points, and there's like 4 of them coming in, the AI treats them about the same as they'd treat a swarm of talons. And if you're being attacked by a swarm of talons, you can still fight the enemy. You can still roll up to an enemy cruiser and fight the talons at the same time as fighting the enemy cruiser. Right? Because even if the talons are going to tip things in the enemy's favor, sure, but as things start to get bad, you still have enough time to back off. If all of those fighters are worth 30 ordnance points and you try to fight the enemy, there's not going to be that leeway. You're just going to die. You're not going to have, like, oh, I'm over 90% flux, I've got to back off now. No, at that point you're just dead. And that's part of the problem with overpowered fighters, is not just that they're overpowered, they also just completely break the AI. And so the only counter is to babysit your ships, and whenever they get targeted, you have to pull them back, because if you don't, they're going to completely underestimate the threat. And so that's another reason. Those are the main reasons why fighters don't get stronger than this. And how strong are they? They're C tier. They're not terrible. If you mass up a bunch of them, these things are a complete menace against destroyers and cruisers. Light mortars don't sound very threatening, but when you've got 6 of them firing at close range where they're not going to miss, even against like an eagle, that opening at the back just gets completely obliterated by warthogs in a short amount of time, and then its engines go out, and they just keep doing damage. Even if they don't get through its shields, or they take a long time to get through its shields, they're eventually going to kill it. Now, a couple of weaknesses here. They're a bit slow, and they have only 2,000 engagement range. So, similar to the Thunders, or I guess in this case, they're kind of the opposite of the Thunders, but it has the same effect. Shorter engagement range and slower speed means that they don't pair very well with other fighters, except you can make an exception for the broadsword. Like, if you've got a legion, you could run like a mix of 2 and 3 or 3 and 1. That extra kinetic damage will help them get through shields. And it's also, like, it's probably overall more effective to just run warthogs, but the broadswords being cheaper and the fact that they help with shields makes it kind of a nice mix, despite the difference in engagement range and the difference in top speed. Warthogs are also the most durable of any fighters, and in fact they got a buff in the form of insulated engine assembly, because most fighters, you'll notice, die when they're shot. But when you get to broadswords and warthogs that are a lot more durable, they can actually survive being shot a few times. And for the first time you might notice that fighters flame out when they're shot, because the whole hull counts as their engine, as far as I'm aware. So once they take enough damage, they flame out. And when they flame out, they don't really get to aim at the target. So they used to lose a fair amount of their DPS from flaming out, but now that they've got insulated engine assembly, that's less of an issue. They can definitely do work, but the limitations of short range and being more expensive than the other options means you're going to use them sometimes, but they're not nearly as versatile or ubiquitous as their little brother, the broadsword. Sarissa, that's also an A. I might have put it in S tier, they're really good, but I think broadswords in comparison are a lot more versatile, whereas these things are pretty much exclusively for battle carriers. Broadswords you can kind of put on anything. But for battle carriers, these things are insanely good. They bring kinetic damage at close range for just 12 ordnance points. They've got the same, as you can see, they've got the same hull integrity and armor as a warthog, and the same replacement time as well, so even if they die, they're not draining too much. And they've all got dual light autocannons. That's some pretty solid range for a fighter in the form of kinetic damage, and the canister flak is good against swarms of small missiles. In fact, I believe they can even stop Reapers. Now, what they're not going to stop, or at least not consistently, is salamanders. Because the canister flak has a significant cooldown, sometimes things like salamanders are going to sneak by. They're not reliable at shooting those down. But they will absolutely save you from large volleys of missiles because of the area of effect damage that the canister flak does. These things are very good. If you have a battle carrier and you want it to get close to the enemy, they're a fantastic choice. You might not always load them up on a legion, because the legions, depending on the build, might want to sit at longer range. Whereas something like the Odyssey, a high-tech ship that lacks access to kinetic damage, that's got high mobility and likes to get close to the enemy because it's got energy weapons, they're almost perfect. Aside from the issue where they're not as reliable against salamanders, they're basically perfect. That's like the one issue that they've got there. These things are very, very good, and in fact, you would probably mount them on every single destroyer if not for the recent change, where now these things will increase the deployment points of a ship by 3. if you put it in converted hangar. Even then, it's still worth considering. Flash bomber. I'm going to put these in C. These things can wipe out enemy fighters if they run into them, but for the most part what you're going to use them for is attacking capital ships and attacking stations. Because when they get into an attack run and they're launching multiple proximity charge launchers in this rolling wave of destruction, they're very difficult to stop. Almost no amount of point defense is enough. These things will just roll over the enemy. The big downside that they have is the replacement time. 18 seconds individually is the same as the longbow, but the wing is twice the size. So if these things get wiped out, it completely tanks your replacement rate. This is on top of the fact that they're never going to hit anything faster than an onslaught. So, in general, I would not give these to the AI. A good use case for these will be for a player-piloted ship, because you can target exactly what ship you want to target, and then, when they're done with their attack run, you can actually tell them to regroup. One of the problems that the AI sometimes has with bombers is if it doesn't finish off the target in one run, it just sits on engage and continuously sends them out one at a time, even as they die, which is really not a good idea. You want to group up your bombers to oversaturate enemy defenses. Sending them out in a continuous stream one at a time as they respawn is a terrible idea. And the AI sometimes does that with flash bombers, which are already really hard on your replacement rate. But in player hands, you can send them in one big attack run against a capital ship, and then as soon as that's over, switch back to regroup, wait for them to recover, wait for your replacement time to get back up to 90%, and then send them out again. So a good use case for these might be on a Legion, if you're piloting it yourself, where you build the Legion mostly to fight smaller ships, because the Legion has the raw stats to beat cruisers or destroyers or frigates. But, being a battle carrier, it's going to struggle a bit against larger ships. So if you run flash bombers, you can rely on the Legion's main guns to beat anything smaller than yourself, and anytime you run into another capital ship, you can demolish it with flash bombers. That's something worth trying. It's very niche, and I have seen, I believe it was Captain Hector, used like a weird astral build to fight on, like against a bunch of, against like 5 Ordos, and I think one of the builds he experimented with that could do the job had like flash bombers mixed in with warthogs. It was some really weird stuff. There's definitely some edge cases like that where hyper-optimized builds can do some weird things with them, but for the most part, I would just use these on a player-controlled ship, specifically to demolish heavier ships. The Cobra, also C. The Cobra is a very, very unique beast. Now we're starting to get a bit more expensive with our ships, up at 15 ordnance points. But 15 is still not too bad. What these things really have going for them is 2 things. Number 1, they're the only bomber with Reapers, which means that they're the best at actually overloading a target. And number 2, the replacement time. 20 seconds individually is worse than a lot of the other options, but the Cobra is only one fighter, meaning that it's 20 seconds for the entire wing. And things get even weirder here, because there's a strange little mechanic where bomber wings seem to be able to redeploy one of their bombers even while they're waiting for the other ones to return. Because normally, once the bombers launch their payload, they have to fly, even if they survive, they have to fly back to the carrier, and while they're flying back to the carrier, they're still draining replacement rate. But there seems to be some kind of mechanic where the carrier is allowed to deploy one bomber per wing before they get back. And this interacts very strangely with the Cobra, because it's the only bomber in the wing. So I've loaded Herons up with triple Cobra. It launches an attack wave, but because the Heron is really fast and it's moving around the map all the time, the Cobras didn't quite make it back to the Heron yet. And before they did, it launched another wave of Cobras. And then what happened? They all survived, and now there's 6 Cobras all flying back to the Heron to land on it. And before they got back, it launched a third wave of cobras. So now one heron has 9 cobras on the battlefield, and 6 of them are trying desperately to get back, and 3 of them are just heading out to do another attack run. So things there in that regard get really weird. But that's all an advantage, because when it deploys the new runs, not only do the new ones get to go attacking, but it also counts as refilling the wings, so the ones that are returning are no longer draining any replacement rate. Out of all the bombers, the Cobra is probably, like, even with the other ones having lower replacement times individually, the bomber that has the least punishment on your replacement rate is the Cobra, on top of the fact that it's best at overloading the enemy with its Reapers. Now, the downsides of the Cobra should be pretty obvious. It's not going to hit smaller targets. It can sometimes hit destroyers, but even against cruisers, it can be pretty unreliable. Not only can they dodge out of the way, they can also just shoot down the Reapers a lot of the time. Against capital ships, especially if the capital ship is being pressured by another one of your direct combat ships, that's when the Cobra is really going to come in clutch. It's going to overload it, and then 2 more Reapers are going to hit it, especially if it's coming in from a Heron, where you can boost that damage by 50%. Imagine, those Reapers aren't doing 40,000 damage like a normal Reaper. On the Cobra, they're doing 6,000 damage each, and 3 of them. So, the best use case for these really is triple Cobra on a Heron, specifically to target heavier targets. I do think you can get some good use out of them on the Legion or the Astral. Once you get over 3, I wouldn't really use these on a Mora most of the time, but on a Legion or an Astral with 4 and 6 fighter bays, you can sneak one of these things in with your other bombers, and it'll do alright. It's mostly going to miss, but for those times that it hits, it's going to make a big impact, and for the times it dies, it's going to be a lot gentler on your replacement rate, which other bombers are not, so having one of them mixed in can make things a little bit easier for your carrier. Xyphos Support Fighter, the most expensive non-bomber. I think it's worse overall than the Sarissa, but it's still pretty good. 18 ordnance points, and they've got advanced optics with burst lasers and ion beams. 1200 range ion beams for 0 flux cost. I mean, an ion beam is 12 ordnance points, a burst laser is 6. So putting each of those on your ship costs 18. The Xyphos wing gives you just double that, but also it doesn't cost you any flux. Even when you factor in convert a hangar, it's kind of hard to deny the value here. And while they don't get targeting units, they do have advanced optics. So that 1200 range ion beam can keep up with most weapons. And then the burst lasers, it's not just that they have burst lasers. These are regular burst lasers. They don't have the higher delay on their recharge rate, which means that they can keep up with more sustained missile volleys. And they also have 360-degree aim. Where the longbows can only fire their burst lasers in targets in front of them, the Xyphos can fire in any direction. Well, the burst laser anyways. The ion beam has to fire forward. Overall, pretty good. They can provide support to... They support low-tech ships pretty well. They give them some ion damage, which low-tech ships tend to lack. And those 360-degree no-scoping burst lasers give them some pretty good point defense coverage, which is something that low-tech ships really need. That being said, you can also use them on high-tech ships. Like, loading 2 of these into an Odyssey is still really good. But I think right now the best way to load up an Odyssey is probably 1 Sarissa and 1 Xyphos. The Xyphos with their burst lasers provide pinpoint accuracy against salamanders, while the Sarissas have the canister flak to deal with larger volleys of missiles. And then the 2 of them together provide a combination of kinetic damage and EMP damage. You do have to get relatively close to the enemy, which most capital ships don't want to do, but the Odyssey does, and it's got 2 fighter bays, so it can actually mount both of them. Very solid combination. Dagger. This is the first guided bomber. Well, the first high-explosive guided bomber. Like, the longbow, of course, is also guided, but that's kinetic. Out of all the high-explosive bombers, there's only 2 that have guided weapons. The daggers and the tridents. And the first of them, the daggers, is the more generic option at 18 ordnance points. Top speed 175, almost as fast as khopesh. They pair up perfectly with your daggers and with your longbows. The guidance system makes them not perfect at hitting frigates, but semi-reliable. Like, you can usually expect one or two of these to hit, even if the frigate manages to dodge one of them. The really big downside here is not just that they're more expensive, but the replacement time. Same individually as the longbows, but they're also just as fragile, and now there's 3 of them. So when these get wiped out, they're a lot harder on your replacement rate. In the early game, the classic combo of broadsword, longbow, dagger is pretty good for taking out frigates. If you get like an early heron, they can take out frigates pretty well. But when you get to the late game and battles start to get longer, you really start to feel that drain on replacement rate. So you're going to need carrier group, you're going to need an officer. You might even need that one hull mod, expanded deck crew, which you might think, with how important replacement rate is, that expanded deck crew would be a default. But that's the thing. If you've got fighters that have good replacement rate and they're staying up at 80 to 90% over a long battle, then expanded deck crew is not really doing much. They're already staying out of the death spiral. So the extra help from that is not worth 25 ordnance points. Versus ships that are spiraling down to 30% at the start, like very quickly, expanded deck crew is not super helpful for that. They're still going to spiral down to 30%. Expanded deck crew is really for the stuff that's kind of at the knife's edge, where for the early stages of a battle, it's doing okay, but then as the battle drags on, they spiral. Like, for stuff that's at the knife's edge, like this specific combination, that's where you want to bring in expanded deck crew. But yeah, overall, if you're looking for something that's more reliable, decent speed, that's where the dagger comes in. Just be aware, it does drain your replacement rate in longer battles. Then we've got the piranha. No, not the piranha, the perdition. And this is where we get another potentially controversial D. Now, triple hammers is a really good payload. The problem is everything else. Triple hammers has more, they're faster and they've got more hit points, and in fact more total damage than a single cobra. So they're really good at getting through. Compared to the cobra, they're better at getting through point defense. In fact, they're kind of like the flash bomber in that sense, forcing their way through point defense and delivering a large volume of high explosive damage. Really, the problem with the perdition is everything else. 20 ordnance points. That's expensive. Top speed, 140. That's slow. That's barely faster than a warthog. Durability. It's not fragile, but it's only really medium. And when you look at the replacement rate, 15 individually is not bad. But you've got 3 of them. So when they get wiped out, that's 45 seconds. Almost as bad as the Lux. And not really any more durable. But the Lux is less armored hull. It does have shields and it does have flares. So both of these things are really hard on your replacement rate. And they're more expensive than comparable options, and it's really hard to justify finding a niche for this thing. If you want to use this thing to force its way through point defense on heavier targets, you're probably better off with the flash. But if you want something that the AI can use without draining too much, like the flash they won't, so instead you want something that's more AI friendly, stacking up cobras. And it's hard to justify using these things over either of those options when it's so much more expensive and slower. A lot slower. Well, maybe not a lot slower. It's like 160 for the cobra, 170 for the flash, and 140 for this thing. So it's not necessarily that it's terrible, it's just hard to find a niche for it when other bombers seem to fill anything you would want it to do, but better. And on top of that, again, it's more expensive. So I put it in D tier. And then the trident, the most expensive of all the fighters. I like the trident, but I'm going to put it in C tier. You might think that it's too expensive, but the real issue here is that top speed, 130. That's the real killer for the trident. It's just so slow. It takes so long. I tried putting these on a heron, but I think that's a terrible idea now. because the heron, relying on its speed to defend itself, means that if it's running away from the target and the tridents are trying to get back, well, let's say the heron is moving away at a speed of 100, and these things are chasing it at a speed of 130. That means that they only close the distance by 30 units a second. Compare that to the dagger at its speed of 175. It's closing the distance at a speed of 75 a second. So while it doesn't have double the speed of the trident, if you mount them on a heron and it's trying to get back to the carrier, oftentimes it's going to take less than half as long. So for this reason, the trident is often not worth it. Now, some people think that it's too expensive. You're paying 7 more ordnance points for 1 extra Atropos, but let's do a little math here. The dagger is 18 for 3. You're paying 6 per Atropos. Paying 7 for 1 more is not unreasonable, especially when later Atropos are better. Like, let's think about this. 1 Atropos by itself is not getting through point defense in most cases. If you have 2, well, now one of them gets shot by point defense, and the other one gets through. If you have 3, now 2 of them are getting through. If you have 4, so you can see, a lot of the time when it comes to missiles, oversaturating the target's defenses is what you want to do. So firing a single Atropos, or let's say you've got 2 versus 4 instead of 3 versus 4. 4 is more than twice as good as 2 because you're oversaturating the enemy's defenses. So paying those earlier Atropos should be cheaper. Paying 6 for the first 3 and then 7 for the 4th one is a totally reasonable amount. Really, the killer is the top speed. But ironically, with that 25 per second replacement time, you might think that that's bad. But it's actually better than the dagger, because 3 daggers takes 56 seconds, and these, 2 of them, take 50. So if the wing gets wiped out, they actually take less time. And if you want to divide it by ordnance points per Atropos, that's 25 seconds to get a true Atropos. In other words, you're at 12.5 seconds of replacement time to replace 1 Atropos, versus 18 seconds for 1 Atropos. So when it comes to a battle of attrition, like, that's just the replacement time, not to mention the fact that they're also a lot more durable than daggers. So when it comes to the attrition rate on your replacement rate, tridents are better. They're better at attrition. They have a heavier payload. The main downside is more expensive and more speed, or lower speed. Really, the best use case for these things is the Astral. The recall device doesn't just favor bombers. It also kind of sort of favors bombers that are slower, because they only have to, like, their slow speed is only disadvantage on the way out, and then they just teleport back. Now, it doesn't get to use that every single run, but it's going to use it like every other run. So the low speed becomes much less of an issue, on top of the fact that the Astral has the ordnance points to mount these things. So you can easily load up like 3 tridents. You can load up like 1 broadsword, 1 longbow, a cobra, and 3 tridents. And that's going to do some pretty good damage against all kinds of targets. But outside of the Astral, there's not much of a use case for these. I think people do like putting defensive targeting array on some ships like the Legion. I've done it with the Odyssey, and it is pretty fun having some reloading Atropos that just fire infinitely. I don't know if it's worth the cost, though. Partly because you're missing out on the point defense that the other ones would offer you, but also partly just the straight ordnance point cost. And it's not like defensive targeting array that is doing much else. It's just so that the AI doesn't send the tridents on an attack run. If you're piloting the Odyssey yourself, all you have to do is not hit Z, and they're going to do the same job anyways. And in that sense, they're okay, but I would rather stick with the support fighters. So they're good, but only really in the specific case of the Astral. Actually, going back to the Cobra, one thing I forgot to mention is they kind of pair well with the khopesh, or rather, the khopesh kind of pairs well with other bombers. Because they fire a large volley of projectiles, they can help overwhelm enemy point defense. Like if you've got like a broadsword plus a khopesh plus a cobra, not only do you have flares to distract enemy point defense, but you've also got this volume of missiles that can absorb damage, so to help the cobra get its shot through. So that's another little synergy you can try. But in the case of the triple trident one I was talking about on the Astral, in that case, having 12 Atropos is more or less going to do the same job. Yeah, I think that is everything that I really have to say about fighters for now. So good luck out there, Starfarer, and I'll see you next time.